On the night of September 13, 1942, at precisely 2,100 hours, Colonel Merritt, Red Mike Edson crouched low behind a jagged coral outcrop on the narrow spine of Hill 123. His eyes fixed on the oppressive darkness of the Guadalcanal jungle, where more than 3,000 Japanese soldiers were silently moving toward the 800 Marines under his command, and at 45 years old, a compact, hard-edged officer renowned throughout the Marine Corps as a master of small unit tactics who had never suffered a defeat in combat, Edson understood with chilling clarity the scale of the danger before him, for he was facing an enemy whose night-fighting doctrine had shattered Allied armies from Singapore to the Philippines during the previous 10 months, an enemy that had never lost a coordinated darkness assault and now sought to repeat that record on the coral ridge guarding Henderson Field, the fragile lifeline of the American foothold on Guadalcanal, lying barely 1,000 yards behind the Marine positions like a vulnerable heart exposed to the knife. Edson's commanding general had issued a blunt order to hold the ridge at all costs, yet whispers among fellow officers spoke of the ground as too thin, too exposed, and too easily infiltrated, especially given the dense jungle fingers that pressed right up to the Marine line, the dead ground beyond the reach of mortars, and the natural funnels that forced attackers into close-quarters fighting where Japanese training, discipline, and ferocity had repeatedly overwhelmed Western defenders, and when Edson had first walked the ridge that morning, studying it through field glasses with a waterproof notebook tucked into his breast pocket, his company commanders had warned him with quiet certainty that the Japanese would strike from 3 directions at once, infiltrating through the jungle under cover of darkness just as they had done across the Pacific. But Edson, who had studied those earlier defeats with ruthless honesty, understood that the problem had never been Japanese courage or skill alone, but Allied commanders attempting to defend too much ground with too few men, spreading their forces thin until infiltration shattered cohesion and turned defense into isolated, unwinnable firefights. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, commanding the Japanese 35th Infantry Brigade, had spent weeks planning this assault with meticulous care, coordinating converging attacks by his main force with supporting columns under Colonel Oka and Major Mizuno, intending to crush the Marine perimeter in a single, decisive night blow, seize Henderson Field by dawn, and drive the Americans into the sea, and his troops moved forward armed with Type 92 heavy machine guns, knee mortars, grenades, and bayonets fixed for the final charge, confident from months of uninterrupted victories that American resistance would collapse once the night fighting began. Yet that afternoon Edson had done something that appeared, even to his own men, like an act of desperation, ordering the forward outposts pulled back from the jungle edge and concentrating his battalion along the crest of the ridge, abandoning carefully prepared foxholes and yielding ground without a fight. A move that unsettled Marines, who wondered why their colonel was retreating before the enemy even attacked. But as Japanese scouts crept forward after dusk and found empty positions where they expected resistance, Kawaguchi received exactly the reports Edson wanted him to hear, intelligence that suggested an enemy falling back under pressure to a final, thin line, unaware that Edson had transformed the coming night battle into a cold mathematical equation in which terrain, firepower, and timing would multiply Marine strength and strip away Japanese advantages. Only 4 days after the Tasamboko raid, Edson's 1st Raider Battalion and the 1st Parachute Battalion had moved south from Henderson Field to what division headquarters misleadingly labeled a rest position along the Coral Ridge, and on September 10, 1942, the 800 Marines trudging through knee-high kunai grass already knew that rest would not be found there, for Edson had spent that morning walking the ridge from north to south, measuring distances, studying jungle approaches, and noting how Hill 123 rose as the dominant feature, a coral knob standing 123 feet above the surrounding terrain with clear fields of fire across the open grassland separating the jungle from the ridge, and when Captain William Sperling of a company pointed toward the tree line 600 yards south, warning that multiple Japanese columns would likely emerge from there supported by knee mortars, Edson merely nodded, fully aware that Japanese probing over the previous weeks had mapped Marine positions with methodical patience, following a doctrinal pattern refined from Malaya to the Dutch East Indies: infiltration undercover, converging assaults, and brutal close-quarters combat designed to overwhelm defenders psychologically as much as physically. Instead of scattering foxholes across the ridge, Edson envisioned a different kind of defense, one built on concentration rather than coverage, and as dusk fell he gathered his officers around an ammunition crate and explained what intelligence intercepts confirmed: that Kawaguchi's veteran brigade was massing south of the Lunga River for a major offensive, supported by secondary attacks intended to split Marine attention and prevent reinforcement, and that this ridge, the shortest route to Henderson Field, was the true objective, for if it fell, the airfield would follow. And Edson traced the jungle fingers on his map, explaining how the terrain favored infiltration but could also be turned into a killing ground if the Marines forced the enemy into open approaches under interlocking fire. On September 11th, Japanese bombers appeared overhead, dropping 500-pound bombs that shattered coral and confirmed the ridge's importance, and that evening Edson coordinated closely with Lieutenant Colonel Pedro del Valle of the 11th Marines, ensuring artillery support from 75mm pack howitzers and 105mm guns north of Henderson Field, pre-registering fires on every draw, saddle, and open approach so that artillery could strike accurately even in complete darkness. And the real gamble came on September 12th when Edson ordered the final withdrawal of forward outposts to the ridge crest itself, a move questioned openly by officers like Captain Kenneth Bailey, who feared it would allow Japanese forces to close too easily. But Edson explained that fighting the Japanese in the jungle played directly into their strengths, whereas pulling back would force them to cross open ground under observation, allow every Marine weapon to support every other, and enable artillery to fire danger close without fear of hitting friendly troops, transforming the ridge into a tightly bound fortress of fire. When the first Japanese probes emerged at 2,100 hours on September 12th, moving with professional discipline rather than reckless charges, they found abandoned foxholes and no resistance, and Major Yukichi Kakusho's battalion advanced confidently through the draw between hills 80 and 123, while Major Maso Tamura's men infiltrated from the west using game trails that brought them within 200 yards of the Marine line. Yet as soon as they crossed the open ground, machine guns on the ridge erupted, revealing a defensive system far denser than expected, with water-cooled Brownings like Sergeant John Bassilone's M1917 delivering sustained, accurate fire across pre-sighted beaten zones. And when Japanese knee mortars responded, Marine forward observers called down pre-registered artillery that smashed support weapons before they could settle into effective fire, and by midnight the probes had failed to penetrate the Marine line, leaving over 100 Japanese dead in what amounted to reconnaissance in force. But Edson knew this was only the beginning. At dawn on September 13th, he walked the ridge among spent casings and blood-stained coral, listening to reports that confirmed heavy Japanese losses. Yet he told his officers without hesitation that the enemy had merely been testing, and at 0900 hours he made the defining decision of the battle, ordering another withdrawal that would consolidate all remaining forces onto the northern half of the ridge around Hill 123, abandoning Hill 80 entirely, a move that again looked like retreat to Japanese observers and confirmed Kawaguchi's belief that Marine morale was cracking, but in reality allowed Del Valle's artillery to bring unprecedented firepower to bear at ranges as close as 400 yards, with batteries recalculating firing data and pre-plotting concentrations that could be delivered by code word within minutes, as Japanese radio traffic surged through the afternoon, indicating full brigade commitment for the coming night. Edson's Marines dug deeper, sighted weapons carefully, and prepared for a fight that would decide the fate of Henderson Field. And at 2,000 hours Japanese artillery opened a heavy preparatory bombardment, shells screaming overhead and shattering coral as Marines pressed into their foxholes, waiting for the assault, which came after 20-30 hours as thousands of Japanese infantry advanced through the darkness in converging columns, led by officers who believed absolute aggression would carry the ridge. But almost immediately Marine forward observers called in artillery, and within minutes 105mm shells burst among the attackers, tearing formations apart even as survivors pressed on. and when they reached the base of Hill 123, machine guns like Basilones opened with devastating effect, cutting down waves of attackers who struggled uphill under interlocking fire, while Japanese light machine guns and grenades replied in a lethal exchange that lit the ridge with muzzle flashes and tracer, and at 2,230 hours Major Kenneth Bailey's sector on the eastern slope became the focal point of savage hand-to-hand fighting as Japanese soldiers surged into foxholes with bayonets and grenades, wounding Bailey himself with a grenade blast that left his head bleeding and eyes blinded. Yet he continued to command, rallying Marines, directing counterattacks, and calling for artillery that shattered Japanese reserves before they could exploit the breach. And as midnight passed, Kawaguchi committed his last reserves, convinced a breakthrough was imminent, only to have them caught in the open by the full weight of Del Valle's massed guns at 0100 hours on September 14th, when coordinated barges of 105 mm and 75 mm fire obliterated assault formations at point-blank range, breaking the spine of the attack and forcing survivors into a chaotic retreat through the jungle. By dawn the ridge remained in American hands. Over 600 Japanese bodies lay scattered across the approaches, and abandoned weapons and equipment marked the paths of retreat, while Marine losses, though painful, were far lighter, and as Edson surveyed the battlefield he understood that his apparent retreat had become one of the most decisive defensive victories in Marine Corps history, preserving Henderson Field, shattering Kawaguchi's brigade, and forcing the Japanese command to abandon hopes of a quick victory on Guadalcanal. With the consequences rippling across the Pacific as reinforcements arrived, air operations resumed at full strength, and the lesson of Bloody Ridge, of concentration, firepower, and disciplined defense, reshaped American doctrine and marked the moment when Japanese night attack supremacy finally met its limit on a narrow spine of coral soaked in blood and history.